The canyon had been my sanctuary, my prison, my silent confessor for 3 long years. I thought I'd seen every trick it could play, every shadow it could cast, every desolate echo it could throw back at me. But that morning, when my gaze drifted up to the gnarled branches of the ancient oak that stood sentinel over the creek, the world shifted on its axis. A girl was hanging there, a vibrant splash of blue against the muted greens and browns, struggling for her very life. My boots, worn smooth by countless treks, crunched against the dry earth. Every morning, just as the first slivers of dawn painted the sky, I walked this same rocky path, checking my traps, scanning the horizon for anything that didn't belong, anything that might shatter the fragile peace I'd carved out for myself. The canyon walls, ancient and imposing, rose around my small cabin like formidable guardians, shielding me from a world I'd deliberately abandoned. The silence out here was absolute, so profound I could hear the rhythmic thud of my own heart against my ribs. But today that familiar silence was pierced by an anomaly. A piece of vivid blue fabric, a vibrant, impossible color in this desolate landscape, fluttered against the rough bark of the massive oak. I squinted, my mind trying to dismiss it as just another scrap of cloth torn from some traveler's pack and carried here by the relentless wind. Then I saw them. Legs. Kicking. My heart didn't just stop. It seized, a cold iron fist squeezing the life out of me. A young woman, impossibly young, hung from a thick, unforgiving rope. Her hands, pale and desperate, clawed futilely at the branch above her head. Her face was a mask of crimson eyes, wide with a terror so raw it clawed at my own throat. She fought a desperate, silent battle against gravity and the relentless march of time. The beautiful blue dress that had first caught my eye was now a tangled shroud twisted around her struggling form. My rifle, a familiar weight in my hands, just moments before clattered to the ground, forgotten. I ran. "Hold on," I bellowed, my voice rough from disuse, tearing through the silence and echoing off the canyon walls. I scrambled up the rocky slope toward the tree, my lungs burning, my legs pumping, a primal urgency propelling me forward. Her eyes, wide and pleading, locked onto mine, and in their depths I saw it. Something that made my chest tighten with an unfamiliar ache. Hope. Pure, desperate, agonizing hope that someone, anyone, had finally come to save her. I reached the base of the oak, my breath ragged, and looked up. She was about 12 feet off the ground, too high for me to reach, but low enough that the fall hadn't snapped her neck. Her breathing was a series of tortured gasps, short and shallow, as the rope bit deeper into her throat. "I'm going to get you down," I called out, my voice strained, my eyes frantically scanning the ground for anything at all I could use. "Just hold on a little longer." My hands, usually steady, trembled as I spotted a fallen branch, thick enough just barely to support my weight. I dragged it over the wood, scraping against the dry earth, and propped it against the trunk. I tested its stability with my boot, a silent prayer on my lips. The wood groaned under the pressure, a living thing protesting its burden, but it held. As I climbed, each second felt like an hour, an eternity stretched thin. I could hear her struggling above me, the rope groaning a sickening protest against the branch, a sound that grated on my nerves. When I finally reached her level, I wrapped one arm around her waist, my muscles screaming with the effort, and pulled my knife. With quick, desperate strokes, I sawed through the rope, the fibers parting with a series of sharp snaps. We tumbled to the ground in a heap, a tangle of limbs and desperation. I rolled away, my body aching, and immediately turned to her. She was gasping, her hands instinctively clutching at her throat, coughing violently as air precious and life-giving rushed back into her lungs. Her blonde hair, disheveled and matted with sweat, clung to her face, and angry red marks stark against her pale skin circled her neck where the rope had been. "Easy now," I said, my voice, to my own surprise, gentler than it had been in years. "You're safe. Just breathe." She looked up at me, her eyes the color of a winter sky, a startling, piercing blue. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was different now, heavy with unspoken questions, with the lingering scent of fear and the fresh tang of survival. There was something haunting in her gaze, something that told me this wasn't just an accident, not a moment of despair. This was something far more sinister. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken rasp. "They'll be here soon. And when they find me," I felt the familiar, unwelcome weight of dread settle in my stomach. For 3 years, I had meticulously built this solitude, a fortress against the world's problems, against other people's pain. But looking at this girl, seeing the raw terror in her eyes, I knew with a chilling certainty that my carefully constructed isolation was about to shatter. "Who's coming?" I asked, though a part of me already dreaded the answer, already knew it would be something I couldn't simply walk away from. She struggled to sit up, wincing, as the movement pulled at her injured throat, a fresh wave of pain washing over her face. "Men who won't stop until they drag me back to a fate worse than hanging." Just then the distant thud of horses' hooves echoed through the canyon, carried on the morning wind like a death knell. My jaw tightened. I realized with a sickening lurch that saving this girl's life might have just cost me everything I'd spent 3 years trying to protect. The horses were getting closer, their rhythm purposeful, not the leisurely pace of casual travelers. These men rode with a singular intent, and that intent was the trembling girl beside me. "What's your name?" I asked quickly, my voice urgent as I helped her to her feet. "Alara," she whispered, still rubbing her throat, her eyes darting nervously towards the sound. "Alara?" "Well, Alara," I said, grabbing my rifle, the familiar weight, a small comfort in the face of this new threat. "We need to move. Now." I took her hand, her fingers surprisingly cold, and led her away from the oak tree towards a cluster of jagged rocks that offered some semblance of cover. Her legs were unsteady, but she kept pace with me, glancing back every few steps as the sound of approaching horses grew louder, more distinct, more menacing. "They'll kill you if they find you helping me," she said, her voice laced with guilt and fear, a desperate plea for me to abandon her. I paused behind a massive boulder, the rough stone cool against my back, and looked at her. There was something about Alara, a flicker in her winter sky eyes, that reminded me of someone else, someone whose memory I had tried to bury beneath these very canyon walls. The same defiant spirit tempered by a heartbreaking vulnerability, the same way of looking at the world as if it had already betrayed her once too often. "Let me worry about that," I said, my voice low, firm. "Right now I need to know what kind of men we're dealing with." Alara's face went pale, a stark contrast to the angry red marks on her neck. "The worst kind. Silas Thorne and his men. They own half the territory around here, and what they don't own they take." The name hit me like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that stole my breath. Silas Thorne. After 3 years, that name could still make my hands tremble with a raw, visceral rage. I had come to this canyon to forget, to let the past stay buried, a festering wound hidden beneath layers of solitude. But it seemed the past wasn't quite finished with me. "Silas Thorne," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper, the name, a bitter taste on my tongue. Alara noticed the change in my expression immediately, her eyes widening with a dawning realization. "You know him." Before I could answer, the sound of horses rounded the bend and 5 riders came into view. Even from this distance, I could pick out Silas's distinctive black hat, the cruel set of his shoulders. The man sat his horse like he owned the world, which in many ways he did. Alara, Silas's voice boomed across the canyon, smooth and commanding, carrying an undertone of menace. "I know you're here, girl. Come out now and I might be merciful." I felt Alara tense beside me, her breathing quickening, her body trembling. I could see her fighting the primal urge to bolt, to run blindly into the open. "He wants to marry me," she whispered, her voice choked with disgust. "My father owes him money and I'm the payment. But marriage isn't what he has in mind. He just wants to own me like he owns everything else." Silas's horse stopped near the oak tree, its hooves kicking up dust, and the man dismounted with a casual, arrogant confidence. He was older than I, remembered streaks of gray creeping into his dark beard, but his eyes were just as cold, just as calculating as they'd been 3 years ago. "Alara," Silas called again, his voice dripping with false concern. "You've caused enough trouble. That little stunt with the rope was dramatic but unnecessary. You know you belong to me." He paused, his gaze falling on the cut rope, his face darkening with dawning understanding. Someone had helped her. Someone was still here. "Well, I'll be damned." "Spread out, Silas," commanded his men, his voice sharp, cutting through the morning air. "Search every rock, every shadow." She didn't cut herself down. The riders began moving in different directions, their hands resting on their weapons, their eyes scanning the terrain with predatory intent. I knew we had at most minutes before we'd be discovered. I looked at Alara, seeing the resignation creeping into her eyes, the last flicker of hope dying. "There's nowhere to run, is there?" she asked quietly, her voice devoid of emotion. I thought about my cabin hidden deeper in the canyon, about the meager supplies I'd stored there, about the life I'd built in isolation, a life meant to be free of this kind of chaos. Then I thought about Silas Thorne and what that man had taken from me 3 years ago. My wife Lillian, my daughter Daisy, my entire world. There's always somewhere to run, I said, my voice harder now, infused with a cold resolve. But sometimes running isn't the answer. I stood up from behind the boulder, my rifle in hand, making myself visible to Silas and his men. The effect was immediate. Silas's head snapped in my direction, and for a moment the powerful man looked genuinely shocked, his arrogant facade cracking. "Well, I'll be damned," Silas said again, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face, a mask of cruelty. "Caleb Stone, I thought you were dead." "Not yet," I replied, my finger finding the trigger of my rifle, the cold metal a familiar comfort against my skin. Silas's smile widened, a chilling display of amusement. "Still playing the hero, I see. Still trying to save people who can't be saved." The words cut deep, bringing back memories I had tried so desperately to forget, memories that still bled. But this time would be different. This time I wouldn't let Silas Thorne take everything away. "Elara belongs to me," Silas continued, his voice low and menacing. "Walk away and I'll pretend I never saw you. Interfere and I'll finish what I started 3 years ago." I felt Elara move closer behind me, her hand touching my shoulder. A light, almost imperceptible touch. In that touch I felt something I hadn't felt in years, something that ignited a spark within me, a reason to fight. But Silas had 5 men with him, all armed, all loyal, and I had 1 rifle, and a girl who could barely stand. A girl who had just escaped death. As Silas's men began closing in from all sides, a tightening semicircle, I realized that saving Elara might cost me everything, including my life. "You made a mistake coming back here, Silas," I said, my rifle trained on the man who had destroyed my life, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "This canyon doesn't belong to you." Silas laughed, the sound echoing off the rocks like a curse, a mocking, triumphant sound. "Everything belongs to me, Stone. Your wife learned that lesson. Your little girl, too." The words hit me like bullets, each one tearing a fresh wound in my soul. But I kept my weapon steady, my gaze locked on him. Behind me, Elara gasped, a sharp intake of breath, understanding flooding her face as she realized this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about old wounds festering and unhealed. "What did you do to his family, Elara?" whispered her voice, horrified, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. Silas's eyes glittered with cruel satisfaction, a malicious glee. "Oh, she doesn't know. Well, let me enlighten the lady. 3 years ago, Caleb here thought he could stand up to me, thought he could rally the town against me when I started collecting what people owed me. His wife and daughter paid the price for his heroics." My hands trembled with a white-hot rage, a consuming fire, but I forced myself to stay focused. Silas's men were positioning themselves in a semicircle, cutting off any escape routes. One wrong move and both Elara and I would be dead. "They were innocent," I said, through gritted teeth, the words tearing from my throat. "Nobody's innocent, Silas," replied his voice, chillingly calm. "Your wife chose to marry a fool. Your daughter chose to have a father who couldn't protect her. Elara here chose to run instead of accepting her fate." Elara, to my surprise, stepped out from behind me, her fear replaced by a burning, defiant anger. "My fate? You mean becoming your property or living in fear every day until you get tired of me and move on to the next girl?" Silas's expression darkened, his amusement vanishing. "You'll learn respect one way or another. She's not going anywhere with you," I said, my voice firm, unwavering. "And how exactly do you plan to stop me?" Silas gestured to his men, a dismissive wave of his hand. "You see 5 rifles pointed at you. You see that you're outnumbered and outgunned. Be smart, Brooks. This doesn't have to end like last time." But as Silas spoke, I noticed something the other man had missed. The canyon walls with their natural echo chambers carried a new sound, the distinct thud of more horses approaching from the south. Someone else was coming, and from the hurried pace they weren't friends of Silas's. Elara heard it too, her eyes widening with recognition, a flicker of hope returning. "It's my brothers," she whispered, a desperate plea in her voice. "They must have followed your trail." Silas's confidence faltered for just a moment. He'd been expecting to handle one man and a frightened girl, not a potential fight on multiple fronts. But he recovered quickly, his hand moving to his gun. "Then we'll settle this quickly," he said, his voice hard. "Boys, take them both. If her brothers want to fight, they can have one." The moment stretched taut as a wire humming with unspoken tension. 5 men with drawn weapons faced my single rifle. Elara stood frozen between us, a fragile pawn in a deadly game, knowing that whatever happened next would determine whether she lived to see another sunset. I thought about Lillian's last words, about Daisy's frightened cry, about 3 years of suffocating guilt and crushing isolation. Then I looked at Alara, saw the same fierce determination in her eyes that I'd seen in my wife's, and made my choice. Alara, I said quietly, my voice barely a whisper but firm. When I move, you run for those rocks behind us. Don't look back. No matter what you hear, I won't leave you, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. You will if you want to live, I countered, my gaze fixed on Silas. Silas raised his hand, preparing to give the order to fire. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, a thundering crescendo, but they wouldn't arrive in time. Whatever was going to happen would happen in the next few seconds. I took a deep breath, the air burning in my lungs, knowing that this moment would either redeem me or destroy me. But for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't facing it alone. The shot rang out like thunder, but it didn't come from Silas or his men. I dove to the side, pulling Alara with me as bullets began flying from multiple directions. The approaching riders had arrived just in time, creating instant chaos, as Silas's men suddenly found themselves caught between two forces. Finn, Gareth, Alara, cried out, her voice filled with a desperate relief as 2 young men on horseback charged into the canyon, their rifles blazing. Silas cursed a guttural sound of pure frustration and rolled behind his horse for cover as his carefully planned capture dissolved into a full-blown gunfight. "Kill them all," he shouted to his men, his voice raw with fury. But his command was lost in the cacophony of gunfire and shouting, the screams of men and the thud of hooves. I pulled Alara behind the same boulder where we'd hidden before pressing her down as bullets struck the rock above our heads, sending chips of stone flying. I could see Silas's men scrambling for position, confused by the sudden, unexpected arrival of Alara's brothers. "How many brothers do you have?" I asked, reloading my rifle, my eyes scanning the chaotic scene. "Just 2, Alara," replied her voice breathless. "But they're good shots." One of Silas's men went down crying out as he clutched his shoulder, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Another retreated towards the canyon wall, seeking better cover, his face pale with fear. The tide was turning, but Silas himself remained dangerous, his cold eyes scanning the battlefield for an opportunity, a weakness to exploit. I saw that opportunity before Silas could take it. Alara's younger brother, the one she'd called Finn, had gotten separated from his horse and was pinned down behind a fallen log, exposed and vulnerable. Silas was moving towards him, gun drawn, using the chaos as cover for what would be an execution. "Stay down," I told Alara, my voice sharp, urgent. Then I broke from cover. I ran towards Finn's position, knowing I was exposing myself to gunfire from multiple directions, knowing I was a target. A bullet whistled past my ear, a whisper of death. Another kicked up dirt at my feet, but I kept moving, my focus singular, my resolve unyielding. Silas reached the log just as I arrived. The 2 of us faced each other across 20 feet of open ground, both with guns drawn. For a moment, the chaos of the battle seemed to fade away, leaving only the 2 of us and 3 years of unfinished business hanging heavy in the air between us. "You should have stayed hidden, Silas," said, his weapon steady, his eyes cold and unwavering. "Should have let me take the girl and disappear back into your hole." "Some things are worth dying for," I replied, my voice low, firm, the words imbued with a lifetime of pain and regret. Silas's laugh was bitter, a harsh, grating sound. "Worth dying for like your wife was like your daughter. How did that work out for you?" The words were meant to distract me, to make me angry and careless, to drag me back into the despair that had consumed me. But instead they brought clarity, a sharp, piercing focus. I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake, wondering if I could have done something different, if I could have saved them. Now I knew the answer. They died because I hesitated, I said, my voice raw with emotion, because I tried to reason with a monster instead of putting him down. Silas's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something akin to surprise in their depths. "Learned your lesson, have you?" "I have." Both men fired simultaneously. Silas's shot went wide as he stumbled backward, a look of disbelief on his face. My bullet caught him squarely in the chest, but even as he fell, Silas's gun discharged again, a wild, desperate shot finding its mark in my side. Pain flared through my ribs, a searing agony that stole my breath, and I dropped to one knee, my vision blurring. But I kept my rifle trained on Silas. The other man was on the ground now, blood spreading across his shirt, a dark blossoming stain, but his eyes were still filled with hate, a venomous, undying malice. "This doesn't end it." Silas gasped, his voice weak, ragged. "I have other men. They'll come for her." No, I said, standing despite the fire in my side, my legs trembling beneath me. They won't. I walked over to where Silas lay, dying, looking down at the man who had haunted my dreams for 3 years, the architect of my despair. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of triumph, just the quiet, weary understanding that some debts could only be paid in blood. Silas's eyes went blank, the light fading from them, as his breathing stopped a final ragged sigh. Around us, the gunfight was winding down. Alara's brothers had accounted for 2 more of Silas's men, and the remaining 2 were fleeing towards their horses, their courage broken. Gareth, the older brother, rode after them, a grim determination on his face, while Finn checked on Alara, his young face etched with concern. "Alara, are you hurt, Finn?" called out his voice, trembling slightly. "I'm fine," she replied, but her eyes were on me, her gaze fixed on the hand I was pressing against the wound in my side. She ran to me as I sank down against a rock, my face pale from blood loss, the world tilting precariously. The bullet had gone clean through a small mercy, but I was losing blood fast, the warmth seeping out of me. "You're hurt," she said, kneeling beside me, her voice filled with a desperate urgency. "I've had worse," I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth, though the growing weakness in my limbs suggested otherwise, a cold dread creeping into my bones. Alara looked back towards Silas's body, then at her brothers, who were securing the area, their faces grim. When she turned back to me, there were tears in her eyes, shimmering like the winter sky. "Why did you do it? You could have let them take me and saved yourself." I thought about the question, about 3 years of isolation, and guilt about the crushing weight of my past. Because I said quietly the words, a strained whisper, "Some people are worth saving." But as the afternoon sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the canyon floor, and my strength continued to ebb away, a chilling thought began to form in my mind. Had I saved Alara only to leave her with a different kind of burden? Alara pressed her hands against my wound, trying desperately to staunch the bleeding. But the red stain on my shirt continued to spread, a horrifying bloom against the fabric. My breathing was becoming shallow, ragged, and my skin had taken on a gray pallor that frightened her more than Silas's threats ever had. "Finn," she called to her younger brother, her voice sharp with panic. "Help me get him to his cabin. He's losing too much blood." Finn approached cautiously, still holding his rifle, his knuckles white. He was barely 18, with the same blonde hair as Alara, but none of her fierce determination. The gunfight had shaken him badly, leaving him pale and trembling. "Alara, we need to go," he said nervously, his eyes darting towards the canyon entrance. "Gareth's chasing those other men, but they might come back with more. We should take you home while we can." "I'm not leaving him," Alara said firmly, her voice unwavering, her gaze fixed on me. "This man saved my life. He saved all our lives." I tried to speak, to tell her to go, to save herself, but only managed a weak cough. Blood appeared at the corner of my mouth, a dark, ominous sign, and Alara felt panic rising in her chest, a cold, suffocating wave. She'd seen men die before, had watched her own mother waste away from fever, and she recognized the signs, the chilling inevitability. "Where's your cabin?" she asked me urgently, her voice strained with desperation. I raised a trembling hand and pointed deeper into the canyon, towards a narrow path that wound between 2 massive rock formations, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. "Half-mile," I whispered the words, a struggle. "Follow the creek." Finn looked between his sister and my dying form, conflict clear on his young, troubled face. "Alara, he's not going to make it. We should help me lift him, Alara." Cut him off, her voice, brooking no argument. Now, together they got me to my feet, supporting my weight between them as they made their way towards the path. Each step seemed to drain more life from me, each breath a struggle. But I kept moving, driven by the same stubborn will that had brought me out of hiding to face Silas. The cabin, when we finally reached it, was smaller than Alara had expected. It was built into a natural alcove in the canyon wall, almost invisible unless you knew precisely where to look. Inside it was sparse but clean, a single room with a simple bed, a rough-hewn table, and a stone fireplace. They laid me on the bed, and Alara immediately began tearing strips from her dress to make bandages, her movements quick and efficient. She'd helped the town doctor enough times to know the basics of treating wounds, though she'd never dealt with anything this serious, anything this close to death. The bleeding's slowing, she said, more to reassure herself than anyone else, her voice a fragile hope. "That's good, right?" My eyes found hers, and she saw something in them that made her stomach clench. It wasn't pain or fear. It was resignation, a weary acceptance of the inevitable. Ilara, I said quietly, my voice barely a whisper. There's something you need to know. Save your strength, she replied, continuing to work on the bandages, her fingers surprisingly gentle. Silas wasn't lying, I continued, ignoring her protests, ignoring the burning in my side. About my family, my wife, my daughter. They died because of me. Ilara's hands stilled, her gaze fixed on my face. What happened? My voice grew distant, as if I were seeing into the past, reliving the nightmare. I thought I could stand up to him. Thought if enough people joined together we could stop his land grabbing, his intimidation. But Silas doesn't fight fair. Finn moved closer, drawn in despite his nervousness, his young face pale. What did he do? He came to my house one night while I was at a town meeting. I said the words tearing at my throat, each one a fresh agony. Set fire to it with them inside. Made it look like an accident. When I got home, my voice broke, a raw, guttural sound of pure anguish. When I got home, there was nothing left. Ilara felt tears sting her eyes, a sharp, burning sensation. That's why you came here to the canyon. I nodded weakly, the effort immense. Couldn't bear to be around people anymore. Couldn't stand the thought that my pride, my need to be a hero, had cost them everything. But you saved me, Ilara, said her voice, soft, filled with a desperate conviction. You did the right thing. Did I? I asked, a bitter, self-deprecating laugh escaping my lips. Or did I just repeat the same mistake? Now Silas is dead and his men will come looking for revenge. They'll know you had help. They'll know your family was involved. The weight of my words settled over the small cabin like a shroud, a heavy, suffocating blanket of dread. Ilara realized that while they'd won this battle, the war was far from over. Silas had been powerful, connected, his influence far-reaching. His death would bring consequences she hadn't considered, a storm of retribution. Gareth appeared in the doorway, his face grim, his eyes wide with alarm. Those two got away, he reported, his voice strained. And I saw dust clouds to the south. More riders coming this way. Ilara looked at me, seeing the apology in my dying eyes, the silent plea for forgiveness. I'd saved her from one fate only to deliver her to another. The men coming would be looking for justice, or what passed for it in Silas's world. How long do we have? She asked Gareth, her voice barely a whisper. Maybe an hour, he replied, his gaze sweeping the cabin. We need to decide what we're doing. Ilara looked around the cabin at me, growing weaker by the minute. At her brothers waiting for her decision, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. She thought about the rope around her neck, about Silas's cruel smile, about the impossible choice between a forced marriage and whatever revenge his men had planned. Then she looked at me again and saw something she hadn't noticed before. On the table beside my bed was a small wooden box, and poking out from beneath the lid was the corner of what looked like a faded photograph. Caleb, she said softly, her voice barely audible. What's in the box? My eyes moved to the wooden box, and for a moment, Ilara saw a flicker of the pain that had driven me to this isolated canyon, a raw, exposed wound. My hand moved weakly towards it, but I lacked the strength to reach across the small distance, my body failing me. Ilara opened the box carefully, reverently, as if it contained something sacred, something infinitely precious. Inside were two photographs, faded by time but remarkably well preserved. The first showed a woman with kind eyes and dark hair, a gentle smile gracing her lips, holding a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Both were smiling at the camera with the easy joy of people who believed the world was fundamentally good, a world that hadn't yet broken them. Lillian, I whispered, my gaze fixed on the woman's face, a ghost from a happier time. And Daisy, my little girl. Ilara felt her throat tighten, a sudden ache in her chest as she looked at the second photograph. It showed the same little girl, older now, maybe 10, standing next to a man she recognized as a younger version of me. My beard was darker, then my face unlined by grief, and my eyes held a hope that had long since died, a light extinguished by tragedy. They're beautiful, Ilara said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Gareth cleared his throat from the doorway, his voice urgent, breaking the fragile moment. Ilara, those riders are getting closer. We need to make a decision. But Ilara wasn't listening to her brother anymore. She was looking at the photographs, then at my dying face, and understanding something that changed everything. Something that shifted the very ground beneath her feet. You didn't come here to hide, she said, suddenly her voice sharp with a new realization. You came here to die. My silence was answer enough, a confirmation that resonated with a chilling clarity. 3 years, Ilara continued, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with a sickening precision. 3 years of living alone, barely eating, barely existing, waiting for something to take you so you could be with them again. That's why you saved me, isn't it? It wasn't about being a hero. It was about finally having a reason to stop running from death. Finn moved closer to the bed, his young face troubled, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. Is that true? I closed my eyes, the weight of my past pressing down on me. And when I spoke, my voice was barely audible, a ragged whisper. Every morning I woke up wondering why I was still breathing. Every night I went to sleep hoping I wouldn't wake up. When I saw you hanging from that tree, Alara, it wasn't mercy that made me climb up. It was the chance to finally do something worth dying for. The sound of horses grew louder, closer now, so distinct that they could hear individual voices calling to each other, the metallic clink of gear. Gareth ducked back to the window, his rifle ready, his face grim. At least 8 men, he reported, his voice low. Maybe more. They've surrounded the cabin. Alara looked at her brothers, then back at me. The man who had saved her was dying, and the men coming would show no mercy to anyone who had helped kill Silas. Her family was in danger because of her, just as my family had been in danger because of me. But there was a difference. I had been trying to rally a whole town to fight a war I couldn't win. Alara only needed to save 3 people. I'm going out there, she announced, her voice firm, resolute, a decision made. Alara, no, Finn protested, his voice filled with panic. They'll kill you, maybe, she said, her gaze unwavering. But they'll definitely kill all of us if I don't. Silas is dead. They want justice. I'll give them what they came for. My eyes snapped open, a sudden surge of adrenaline coursing through me. Despite my weakness, my voice was firm, commanding. No, I won't let you sacrifice yourself. Not like this. You don't get to choose, Alara replied gently, her voice soft but unyielding. Just like I didn't get to choose whether you'd save me from that tree. Sometimes people do things that matter, and sometimes those things cost everything. She stood up and walked to the door, her resolve clear. But Gareth blocked her path, his face etched with desperation. There has to be another way, he said, his voice pleading. Alara smiled at her older brother, the same brave, reckless smile she'd given him when they were children, and she was about to do something daring. There is another way. You and Finn can escape out the back while I keep them busy. Take Caleb if he can travel. Get him to the doctor in Millerville. I'm not leaving you, Gareth said, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, you are, Alara replied, her eyes firm. Because if you don't, Caleb dies for nothing, and Silas wins even from the grave. Outside, a voice called out, rough and commanding, echoing through the canyon. We know you're in there. Silas Thorne is dead, and someone's going to pay. Send out the girl, and we might let the rest of you live. Alara took a deep breath and reached for the door handle, her hand trembling slightly, but my voice stopped her. Alara, wait. She turned back to see me struggling to sit up, my face determined despite the pain, my gaze fixed on her. If you're going out there, I said, take this with you. I pointed to something hanging on the wall that Alara hadn't noticed before, a gun belt with a worn leather holster. It was Lillian's, I explained, my voice filled with a quiet reverence. She was a better shot than me. Alara strapped on the gun belt, feeling the unexpected weight of the weapon against her hip. It felt right somehow, like she was carrying more than just a gun. She was carrying the memory of another woman who had faced impossible choices. Another woman who had fought for what she believed in. Alara, I said one last time, my voice urgent, despite my weakness, my eyes pleading. Promise me something. Promise me you'll survive this. Whatever it takes, whatever you have to do, you'll find a way to live. She looked at me, this broken man who had given everything to save her, and made the only promise she could, the only promise that mattered. I promise I'll try. But as she opened the door and stepped into the harsh afternoon sunlight, Alara knew that some promises were easier to make than to keep. Alara stepped out of the cabin, her hands visible but ready, Lillian's gun, a heavy, reassuring weight on her hip. 8 men sat on horseback in a semicircle around the small dwelling, their faces hard, grim, etched with the promise of violence. At their head was a man with silver hair and a badge that caught the sunlight, glinting menacingly. Sheriff Gideon Cross, Silas's cousin and closest ally. Alara Cross said, his voice carrying the false courtesy of a man used to getting his way, a thinly veiled threat. You've caused quite a stir. My cousin is dead, and that's a problem that needs solving. Silas got what he deserved, Alara replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, the newfound strength within her. He was going to force me into marriage, and when I refused, he tried to have me killed. Cross's smile was cold as winter devoid of warmth or humanity. That's not how I heard it. The way I understand it, you ran off with some desperate man, led poor Silas into an ambush and murdered him in cold blood. You weren't there, Alara, said her voice rising, filled with a righteous anger. You don't know what happened. I know enough, Cross, replied, his eyes narrowing. I know Silas is dead and you're standing there wearing a gun like you think you're some kind of gunfighter. I know there's at least 3 men in that cabin and one of them put a bullet in my cousin. Alara felt the weight of the moment settling around her like a shroud, suffocating and heavy. These men hadn't come for justice. They'd come for revenge for a brutal public display of power. And the only question was how many people would die before they got it. What do you want? She asked, her voice tight with tension. I want the man who killed Silas, Cross said, his gaze fixed on the cabin door. Hand him over and maybe your brothers walk away from this. And me, Alara asked, her heart pounding against her ribs. Cross's expression darkened, a cruel satisfaction in his eyes. You belong to the Thorne family now. Silas's will makes that clear. You'll come with us and fulfill your obligations. Behind her, Alara could hear movement in the cabin. Finn and Gareth working quickly, quietly, getting me ready to move, preparing for the escape she'd bought them with her surrender. The plan was working, but as she looked at Cross's face, she realized she'd miscalculated something important. These men weren't just here for Silas's killer. They were here to send a message, a chilling warning to anyone who might think about standing up to the Thorne family in the future. They needed to make an example that would be remembered for years to come, a brutal lesson. The man who shot Silas is dying. Alara said, her voice strained, a desperate gamble. He's bleeding out in there. You want him. He'll be dead in an hour anyway. That's not good enough, Cross replied, his voice hard, unyielding. I need him alive long enough to hang him proper. Need people to see what happens when you cross us. Alara's hand moved instinctively towards her gun, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. But Cross was faster. His weapon was already in his hand, pointed directly at her chest, a dark, menacing hole. I wouldn't, he warned, a chilling smile playing on his lips. You might be wearing Lillian Stone's gun, but you're not Lillian Stone. She at least knew how to use the thing before she got herself burned alive. The casual cruelty of his words hit Alara like a physical blow, a sickening punch to the gut. These men hadn't just killed my family, they'd enjoyed it. They'd taken pleasure in the destruction of innocent lives and the pain they inflicted. You're monsters, she whispered, her voice filled with a profound disgust. We're practical, Cross corrected, his voice devoid of emotion. We maintain order. We make sure people understand the cost of defiance. From inside the cabin came the sound of splintering wood. Finn and Gareth breaking through the back wall, creating an escape route, a desperate bid for freedom. Cross heard it too, his head tilting slightly towards the noise, a predatory glint in his eyes. Sounds like your brothers think they can sneak away, he said, his smile widening. Boys go around back and collect them. Kill anyone who resists. 3 of his men wheeled their horses and rode towards the rear of the cabin, their movements swift and purposeful. Alara knew her brothers were brave, but they were also young and outnumbered. In a straight fight, they wouldn't stand a chance. Wait, Alara called out, her voice desperate, pleading. I'll come with you willingly. Leave them alone and I'll do whatever you want. Cross considered this. His gun still trained on her, his eyes calculating. What about the man who killed Silas? Alara thought about me lying on the bed inside, bleeding my life away while clutching the photographs of my murdered family. She thought about my 3 years of isolation and guilt, about my desperate desire to finally do something worth dying for. Let me go back in, she said, her voice strained but firm. Let me bring him out. He's too weak to resist and you'll have your hanging. Cross's smile returned, predatory and satisfied. Now you're being reasonable. But if you try anything clever, if there's so much as a hint of trickery, I'll burn that cabin with everyone inside it, just like we burned the stone place. Alara nodded, understanding with a chilling clarity that she was walking back into the cabin not to escape, but to say goodbye. Whatever happened next, she knew that the girl who had run from Silas's forced marriage was gone forever. As she turned towards the door, she heard my voice, weak, but carrying clearly in the afternoon air. Alara, remember your promise. Alara stepped back into the cabin, her mind racing, a whirlwind of desperate thoughts. I lay on the bed, my breathing shallow, but my eyes were alert, fixed on her, filled with a desperate determination. Finn and Gareth had stopped their escape preparations, waiting, watching their faces, etched with fear and uncertainty, to see what she would do. There's no way out, she said quietly, her voice flat, resigned. Cross wants you alive to hang you publicly. He wants to make an example. I nodded slowly as if I'd expected this, as if I'd known this was my true fate all along. Then we finish it here. All of it. What do you mean? Alara asked, her voice a whisper of dread. With tremendous effort, I sat up, my muscles screaming in protest, and reached under my bed. My hand found a small keg of black powder mining explosive I'd stored for clearing rocks from the creek. My eyes met Alara's, and she understood immediately, a horrified realization dawning on her face. No, she whispered, her voice trembling. There has to be another way. Sometimes there isn't, I replied, my voice weary but resolute. Sometimes the only choice is how you face the end. From outside, Cross's voice boomed impatiently, his patience wearing thin. Time's up. Bring him out now, or we come in shooting. I looked at the photographs of Lillian and Daisy one last time, their smiling faces. A poignant reminder of what I had lost, then at Alara, my gaze lingering. Take my horse. There's a trail behind the cabin that leads to the old mining camp. Finn and Gareth know it. Get out of here. I'm not leaving you to die alone, Alara said, tears streaming down her face, her voice choked with emotion. I'm not dying alone, I replied, touching the photographs, my voice filled with a quiet peace. I'm going home. Alara felt tears streaming down her face as she realized what I was planning. This wasn't just about saving her anymore. It was about a broken man finally finding peace, finally finding his way back to the family he had lost. Alara Cross shouted from outside, his voice a roar of impatience. Last warning. I lit a match, the small flame flickering in the dim cabin, and held it near the powder keg's fuse. Go now, I said, my voice firm, urgent. And remember, some people are worth saving. You're one of them. Alara kissed my forehead, a daughter's goodbye to a father she'd never had, a silent promise. Then she grabbed her brothers and ran for the back of the cabin. They burst through the makeshift opening just as Cross's patience ran out, just as his men began to move. Burn it down. Cross ordered his men, his voice a furious bellow, but I was faster. The explosion shook the entire canyon, a deafening roar that vibrated through the very earth, bringing down part of the rock wall and sending a fireball into the sky that could be seen for miles, a beacon of destruction. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left of the cabin except scattered stones and haunting memories. Cross and his men were thrown from their horses by the blast. 3 of them never got back up, their lives extinguished in an instant. Cross himself lay broken against a boulder, his back twisted at an unnatural angle, calling weakly for help that would never come. His reign of terror ended. Alara and her brothers reached my horse and rode hard towards the mining camp, the sound of the explosion echoing behind them like thunder, a constant reminder of the sacrifice made. As they climbed out of the canyon, Alara looked back once at the smoke rising from what had been my final refuge, my last stand. Gareth pulled his horse alongside hers. He saved us all, he said, simply, his voice filled with a quiet awe. Alara nodded, wiping away her tears, a faint smile touching her lips. He saved himself too. They rode towards freedom, carrying with them the memory of a man who had finally found something worth dying for, a man who had chosen redemption over survival. Behind them, the canyon fell silent once more, except for the wind whistling through the rocks, a lonely eternal guardian keeping watch over the place where Caleb Stone had chosen redemption over survival. In the years that followed, Alara would name her firstborn son Caleb, and she would tell him about the broken man who taught her that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. The canyon still stands a monument to the truth that some sacrifices echo longer than the lives that make them. In life, we all carry wounds, some we show, and some we hide deep within our hearts. The story of Caleb Stone reminds us that no matter how broken we feel, there is always a moment when we can choose to stand up for what is right. Caleb spent years in solitude, haunted by guilt and loss, believing he had nothing left to give. But when faced with a young woman's desperate fight for life, he found a reason to act. His choice to sacrifice himself wasn't just about saving her. It was about finding redemption for a heart that had long given up on hope. This reminds us that we are never too old, too weary, or too lost to make a difference in someone else's life. Even the smallest act of courage can ripple through generations, leaving behind a legacy far greater than our mistakes. For those of us in our later years, it's a powerful truth. While we may not control how long we live, we can still control how deeply we love, how bravely we forgive, and how fiercely we protect what matters. Sometimes the greatest gift we leave behind is the proof that it's never too late to choose compassion over fear. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.